Okay, we're live on that. Just going live on all the Instagram's good now. We're good.
Okay. Good evening, everyone. We are live in Efrat, Erev Parshat Vayikra, the last shiur before Pesach. Last week we gave ourselves a little bit of a pre-teaser of this Drush Aleph, which I happen to think it's a long one, but Bezrat Hashem will get through as much as we can. We'll do a good part of it, and if not, we'll skip some parts of it to go to the end of it, which is also really nice. The Drush Aleph is about a question that we asked last week already, which is there's a problem with the Baal Haggadah's statement. The Baal Haggadah says that we say, why do we eat matzah? And we answered the question quickly based on just we did it by heart, or did it out of the text, but we'll hear it now again. Drush Aleph. The Haggadah Shel Pesach, it's found at the end of, on page 615 if you have the Art Scroll edition, and if not, it's probably towards the end after Parshat B'Shalach, right after Yitro, or right around, at the end of Yitro. There's a whole section called the Haggadah Shel Pesach, and in there, Drush Aleph, the question is, the whole question that he's going to ask about is the whole idea of matzah and why do we eat matzah. And let's get into it. So it says, we know that the main part of Magid, one of the parts of Magid is we say, why do we eat this matzah? And it says, that's actually, he's quoting Matzah Zush Anu Ochlim, it's quoting Mishnah, Perek Yud of Masechet Pesachim, Mishnah Hey, and it says, Matzah Zush Anu Ochlim al Shuma, al Shum Shalo Yispik Ritzikam Shal Avotenu Lachmitza Shnikla Lehem Melech Machem Machim HaKadosh Baruch Hu U'Galam Shneimar Vayikra Basek. So that's the Mishnah. The Mishnah says, why do we eat matzah? And that's what we say also in Haggadah. In the Haggadah, we say, why do we eat matzah? We eat matzah because we didn't have time to eat the matzah. We didn't have time to make the bread, bake it. That's what we've all learned. That's what the Mishnah says. We learned it. We learned it in kindergarten already, and that's kind of what we're going through. However, the Zera Shimshon asks a question, and it's not only his question, but he says, Makshima olam, va'alo af kodem lachen itztavu, right? If we look in Perek Yud Bet, when Hashem tells us about Rosh Chodesh, Chodesh Hazeh, and Korban Pesach, he already says we should be eating it with matzah. He says 7 days eat matzah. So then why all of a sudden do we mention in the Haggadah, and that's why that's Zera Shimshon's question against the Baal Haggadah, is why do we say that we didn't have time to eat it? Or why are we eating it? Why are we eating matzah in memory of the fact that we didn't have time to eat it? We should be saying it's a memory of the fact that Hashem told us. Vod, he says the second question, Shenera, Shafuot Abatzek, Ugot Matzot, Kilo Yachlut Mamea. Ha'ilu Hayalem Sheut, Hayu Ofim Natal Chametz. Valo Kvar Nitzavu, Shivat Yamim Saort, Lo Timatzeh. So he says, second question that he asks is, it says in the Psukim, later on in the Psukim, it says that they bake the dough into matzah cakes, whatever that means. We'll find that later. He says because they were driven out and they couldn't delay. So that's why they ate matzahs. But he says, but that means if they made into these small matzah cakes. Why? Because they were being rushed out. Which means that if they had the time, they would have eaten something else. They would have eaten full-on bread, right? And they would have made chametz. But that's difficult. There's a question with that, is because didn't we have a commandment not to eat chametz already in Perek Yud Bet? It already tells us don't eat chametz, don't have leavened bread. So he says, we cannot explain what a lot of the Mizrahi and a couple of other Mefarshim try to explain it according to what Rabbi Yossi HaGlili says. Shepesach Mitzrayim ein chimutzo noheg el yom echad. Rabbi Yossi HaGlili in Pesachim Daf Tzadi Vav says that Pesach Mitzrayim was only 1 day, meaning the Isur of Chametz was only 1 day. And the Zera Shimshon says we can't explain it that way. Sheyom sheyatzu miMitzrayim hayu yom rishon. V'after Rabbi Yossi HaGlili kol hayom asur kidyat shama b'psachim. Right? Even according to Rabbi Yossi HaGlili, the Isur Chametz lasted the entire day, as the Gemara says in Pesachim. And so even though that Rabbi Yossi HaGlili holds of the opinion that we had 1 day of Isur Chametz, right? The morning of the Yetziat Mitzrayim was part of that day, so therefore there's no way we can say, right? Why does the verse say that why does the pasuk say that they would have to let the dough rise had there been more time if chametz was already prohibited for the day of the Yetziat Mitzrayim, the chametz was prohibited. So how could we say that even so, how could they say that it was only for one day? Saying it for one day means that part of that one day of Yetziat Mitzrayim is included. And then he asks a third question. V'od kasher, dehayu shvim u'tzapim ligula shetavo, v'lam yichnisu et atzman l'dochak. Lalush yisa be'oto zman chilpazon, shema yitchametz behilu chaderech. He says the third question, right? The first question is, why does the Baal Haggadah use this proof that we didn't have time to bake the dough as the reason why we eat matzah? Because Hashem commanded to us before in Parshat Bet already when he tells us about Korban Pesach. The second question is that even if we hold according to Rabbi Yossi Aglili, who says that the Pesach Mitzrayim was only one day, that doesn't apply here because that means one day. Part of that one day was the time that the Yetziat Mitzrayim, so they couldn't have eaten chametz. They couldn't have eaten chametz, so that doesn't make sense. And the third question he says is they were waiting. They were anticipating the geula to come. So why did they put themselves under time pressure to make the dough at that last moment? Right? Maybe it was going to come. When we make matzah, we're always rushed for time. But if you know you're anticipating the geula to come, so make be a little prepared. Don't wait for the last possible minute. So he says. Ivra Tosfot Yom Tov v'Kol Ramaz b'Perak Batra Pesachim Mishnahei Tertu B'Zev V'Ayin Sham. He says the Tosfot Yom Tov and the Kol Ramaz, who was Rav Moshe Zakusa, it was a commentary on the Mishnah, and he says Afakusha Rishon Nuchal Teretz b'Masha Katav Zerach Pesach. We could also explain our first question according to the words of Zerach Pesach, which is actually the Abarbanel's perush on the Haggadah. So the Abarbanel's famous statement, he says that there are two kinds of matzah. One is to commemorate the affliction and the shi'abud, the hard work that we had. He says that the Abarbanel says there are two kinds of matzah that we eat, and we kind of, almost everyone uses this kind of basic framework. And almost all of Pesach, in general, all of the Seder is always about half of Geula, half of the hard work, and half of the Geula. So it's always this duality. So he says that when we're talking about Lechem Oni, and then we also have one. The other is to say that we're commemorating the Geula. So we have one part of the matzah is representing the shi'abud, the hard work, and one part of the matzah is representing this, the Geula. And now he says, based on that, so now we've brings other mefarshim as to what the matzah represents. So we're just going to go over the three questions. This is Drush Aleph, which we talked about last week, about the question on the Baal Haggadah's reason as to why he puts Drush Aleph, page 615 in the English, and he said, now we're at 617 already, but he says, why do we use that proof? Why do we say that it was because they couldn't have time to leave. They didn't have time to leave, so that's why they ate matzah, because we were commanded prior to that in Parshat Bet, like we said last week. So he asked. He asked three questions. Question number one is, why does the Baal Haggadah even use that pasuk at all? Because it doesn't make sense. We were commanded already. Then he brings Rabbi Yossi Aglili, which is a famous perush. Rabbi Yossi Aglili is a famous statement that Pesach Mitzrayim, the year of Pesach Yetziat Mitzrayim, was only one day. The Isur of Chametz was only one day. But even if you say according to that one day was Isur Chametz. So then why do we even bring that as an answer? Because the one day of Yetziat Mitzrayim was included in that one day, and therefore we should have the Isur of Chametz. Right? Then in other words, that's not an answer really, he's saying. And then he says the last one is, if you know that the Geula is coming that day, don't wait for the last minute to make your bread. Be prepared. Make yourself a nice sandwich for the road, and then you're good to go. Why do you have to wait for the last possible second, knowing full well that, right? If I know that if I'm anticipating it, right, I know it's going to come at any moment. Why do you put yourself into that time pressure, right? I'd rather be a little bit prepared, right, and then make the dough in that really rush time. And then what happens is that I'm risking. There's very much a risk when I do that it's going to be turned into chametz, right? So if I know I'm going out, then be prepared and make the matzahs beforehand. Otherwise, I'm putting myself in a nice, good situation, a risk situation. So he says,
they actually have they had a chiyuv of the matzah. Do they have an issur of chametz?
Yeah, of course. It says Shivat Yamim Tochal. It says, he quotes that actually before, and he says Shivat Yamim. Right? Either he says Shivat Yamim.
It wasn't for generations. That was for them.
Right. Now he says, according to Rabbi Yossi Glili, it's only for that generation. They had a 1 day isur of chametz. But what included in that 1 day is the Yetziat Mitzrayim itself. But even so, if you whatever way you look at it, either you have a 1-day Isur or you have a 7-day Isur, whichever way you look at it, you still have an Isur of Chametz, so why put yourself into that situation? So he says, he quotes the Abarbanel. The Abarbanel's statement on the Sefer that Abarbanel is called the Zevach Pesach, which is obviously a commentary on the Haggadah, and he says that the Abarbanel offers two kinds of matzah basically, and as I said before, almost everything in the Seder corresponds to two things. Part of it is shiabud and part of it is geula, and that's what he says here. Now he says, "Va'ati shaper lefi zeh." We're on the bottom of page 617 for those who have the English. About like 3 or 4 paragraphs down in the Hebrew one, whichever edition you have, it says, "V'ati shaper lefi zeh, shepesach mitzrayim ein chimutzo noheg elo yom echad b'vad." In light of this approach that Rabbi Yossi Aglio says that Pesach lasted, the Isur of Pesach was only 1 day. Dahainu zeicha l'shiabud. This was because the mitzvah of matzah and the prohibition of eating chametz in Mitzrayim was in commemoration of the shiabud, the hard work, right? So therefore, it's only 1 day. Sha'areg bin acher shehi zecher legula. Adayin lo zachuba. Right? They didn't. The other mitzvah, which is the mitzvah, the matzah, which is the second part of the matzah commemoration, which is the gula, they didn't get to yet. Right? So that's why they only had 1 day in Mitzrayim. Right? And then he says, Shelo nikra geula shlema ela achar kriyat yam suf. Right? Because what happens? When was the geula actually complete? The first part of the geula was Yetziat Mitzrayim, but the whole geula itself was the 7th day of Pesach when they actually Kriyat Yam Suf and the whole thing, and therefore they didn't get to that yet. Tosfot Yom Tov Sham Mishnah Vav. Tosfot Yom Tov basically says something very similar on his commentary to the Mishnah on Perek Vav. Mi'ata al korchach tzarich lomar shema shekatuv shivat yomim motzot tochelu. Right, we're forced to say, basically, according to this, we're forced to say that when the mitzvah, the commandment that you have to eat matzah for 7 days, hulu darot habayim, it's for the future generations. The Isser of chametz and the mitzvah of matzah for the Jews leaving Mitzrayim was 1 day. Okay, after that, it's a second stage, stage 2, right? Stage 1 is Yetziat Mitzrayim, and then the 7-day Isur to eat chametz and the chiyuv to eat matzah is for 7 days. That's for the rest of generations. This is because it's a siman geula. Like we said, it comes for them on the 7th day of Pesach. On the other hand, the matzah that they ate on the first night, like we know, he's zecher l'shiabud. So he says that the matzah that they ate on the first night, they ate on the Yetziat Mitzrayim the first night was to fulfill the matzah of al matzot mirorim, and that's the commandment to remind us of the hard work and the slave and the servitude that we did, and therefore that's why it says ach bayom harishon on the first day. But it says ach, and that usually means to kind of remind means to exclude certain things. So it's like only on the first day. That's why the pasuk is ach bayom harishon, meaning only on the first day you have a special mitzvah. That special mitzvah is to commemorate the matzah of the shiabud, the hard work, and the rest of the time, the other 6 days, is to commemorate the geula. He's going to get to that, sir. And now he says v'o derech drash nuchalomar. He says another way to explain all these difficulties that we had. She'adua, according to, and this is actually, even though it's Kabbalistic, but it's relatively, I don't want to say easy, because I don't understand any of the depths of it, but it's relatively straightforward. We're in the second paragraph on page 618. It says, V'o derech drash nuchalomar, she'adua shetam isur chametz ve'hetar achila matzah, hu remez asibat avodah zarah ve'elohim achirim. He says that the essence of chametz, the isur of chametz, and the essence of eating matzah, and the permission to eat matzah, is represented as kind of like an escape from idolatry and avodah zarah and other gods. Right? Obviously, the chametz is the avodah zarah. The Israel yatzu mirashut Elohim achirim, and the Jewish people during Yetziat Mitzrayim, what they do? They left the domain of these other gods, these other people, and nichnasu l'reshut hayachid, and they went into the private domain. Who's a private domain? Melch malchei hamlachim, yichudu shel olam. Right? HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Ve'ein achinami. Ve'ein achinami. ShaKadosh Baruch Hu tziva l'Yisrael sheboto ador latzeit mireshut Elohim achirim l'ikanes l'reshut HaKadosh Baruch Hu. V'zeh tzivui Parshat Chodesh. Right? He says that's when Hashem tells us. When he gives us the mitzvah of Kiddush HaChodesh and to eat matzah on that time. It's to tell us, get out of Reshut Harabim, meaning Reshut, the other foreign gods, and go into my Reshut, go into the private domain, be private, right? And that's why one of the reasons why we say Shir Shirim, and all these things, Hashem is telling you, be under my umbrella. Don't be under the umbrellas of these other gods. Be under mine. Right? Omnam, Yisrael, Nizdarzu, Betuv Lev, V'dat Nechona. And however, the Bnei Israel were so eager. Once they heard Hashem inviting them into His domain, He was saying, "Is go out of this domain and come into my domain, the domain, the private domain of Hashem." But Bnei Israel were so eager, and they wanted to make. So they were so eager to do that they made the matzah even before they left. And he says, "Shakatuv omer ushmartem et hamatzot." What does it say? The pasuk says, "Ushmartem et hamatzot." How does one fulfill the mitzvah of matzah? Only with things that potentially
from the
five grains, but things that potentially can turn into chametz, right? I can't make it out of corn or whatever, because even if I left the corn flour wet for 6 days, it will never turn into chametz. It will never turn into something. It will be dough, but it won't actually rise and things like that. So he says, Hashar minin lo, that applies to other foods that such as rice and other things that can't be chametz, cannot be used as matzah. Mishum de lo ba'i bihu shuma, right? We don't need some sort of, we don't have to do shmirah on them. V'chashvu v'libam, and Bnei Israel at the time of Yetziat Mitzrayim thought in their heart, we're in the middle of page 619 already. He said, Iman anu mamtinim lalush isatenu achar yetziatenu Mitzrayim, ein zo mitzvah kitukuna, mipnei she'az niya tachat reshut Elohim achayim. So he says, if we wait to start kneading our dough and working the dough when we're already out of the Mitzrayim, then what? Then we're not really, and we're under the domain of Hashem, right? Then we're not really doing, then, right? And then in that domain, in Hashem's domain, there's really no, the outside forces really don't have the ability to, the chametz force doesn't have ability to even be rain, because Hashem is yichudo, it's one. He's not chametz anymore.
So you have to dafka do it in Mitzrayim.
Right, that's what he's saying. It's on Pi Kabbalah, but it makes a logical sense. What he's saying is that Bnei Israel said, we want to keep the mitzvah. It says, Ushmartem et hamatzot. So they said, we're so eager to do this, and they understood, and maybe he doesn't say it was wrong or right, but he's saying is that they were so eager to become under Hashem's domain, private domain, that they said, we can't create chametz in a world that's all matzah. Right? Hashem's world is like this ultimate world, and in a world that's chametz, like the world of Mitzrayim, that makes sense to make chametz. That's when I can make a dough that has the potential to be chametz. But if I make chametz in a world that's all matzah, it's not the best kind of mitzvah. Ela chova aleinu, he says, therefore the Bnei Israel understood that we have an obligation. That's the place that we have to, the place which is chametz, the place which is Mitzrayim, that's the place where we have to make the dough that potentially could rise. Right? And we have to protect it. And then afterwards, we eat the matzah as the ideal matzah in the next, then we eat it. We'll play, we'll work it, we'll do everything. That's what happens nowadays. What do we do when you get to if you finish making the dough and you get it to the table, before you roll it out, and it's still they're not ready to roll it out yet, you have to work it. You always have to be working on the dough, otherwise otherwise potentially turns chametz. So what he's saying is that Bnei Israel said, we'll make the dough in chametz land, and then we'll make the dough, we'll shape the dough and form the dough in chametz, because it makes sense to make a dough that potentially can turn into chametz in chametz land, and then we'll bring it into matzah land, right? Then we'll bring it into Hashem's domain, and then make it there in the ideal scenario. Now he says, but we have a question, and he says we have a question on that. In the night of Yetziat Mitzrayim, as they were eating the Korban Pesach, how did they have a mitzvah to eat matzah and not eat chametz if they were not yet in Hashem's domain yet? Meaning they had to eat, right? So what's the question? He's saying is, technically, they were still in Mitzrayim, which is a land of chametz, right, and not the land of matzah yet. So how could they have the mitzvah of eating matzah in a land that's chametz? Right? So he says,
mitzvah of eating it or preparing it?
you can't eat matzah. It says al motzot u'morim yochlu, right? So I can't eat matzah in a land that's made of chametz, right? He's saying so. He asked that question for a second. So he says milvad matzah shekvar achlu im hakorban. The eating the matzah and under Hashem's domain, it was in addition to the matzah that they had already eaten with the Pesach, with the korban Pesach. Kedichtiv al matzot u'morim yochlu. Shav zot achlu tachad reshut HaKadosh Baruch Hu kedichtiv. And this is when I like this. This is where it comes. We mentioned this in. I believe we mentioned this in Bishalach, that the Yonatan ben Uziel says that for that moment when they had to eat the Korban Pesach, Yonatan ben Uziel, and he's not no small person, says that Hashem took them and he says, I took you. Yonatan ben Uziel says there that Hashem took them on the wings of eagles to eat the Korban Pesach. He took them to Yerushalayim, to the Makom Hamikdash, to eat the Korban Pesach in the right place, and then brought them back. Brought them back. So he says that even when they were eating the Korban Pesach on that night, they weren't actually eating it in Chametz land. They were eating it in Matzah land. Okay. He says, in short, eating matzah represents some sort of entering the domain of Hashem for this 1 week, the special week. And there's many interpretations, but this is an explanation as to why Bnei Israel had to, this whole situation or kind of answers the question as to the challenge against the Baal Haggadah who says that we didn't have time to eat it. And he says that the making of matzahs would also have been outside of Mitzrayim, but the Jewish people want to kind of defeat the Tumah of Mitzrayim by making, while still being in the land of Chametz. So what do? They started making the Chametz there. It kind of like similar to what was the whole idea of the Korban Pesach. Korban Pesach was a lamb. What was the lamb? Exactly. The Elim. So the same thing. Hashem says, I'm going to show them, I'm going to take the lamb. So here he says, I'm going to, Bnei Israel say, we got you. We're going to do the same thing. We're going to make the matzah in land of Chametz, and then we're going to finish it. We're going to finish it off outside, but we're going to start it in the land of Chametz to prove it to them, saying that we want to do it there. Now he says, "V'chol zeh hu lachanatam hatova." The making the dough of in the land of Chametz, he says, was for to kind of express Bnei Israel's willingness to have the right kavanah. Shechilu libam avodot HaKadosh Baruch Hu, because they began making the dough of their matzah by setting their hearts to serve Hashem. Even they were still in a place of chametz. So he says it wouldn't have been as impressive for them to eat matzah in a place which is all matzah. Meaning in the domain of Hashem, everything is matzah, everything is ideal, everything is this great scenario. But it's not as impressive to show your love when you're saying, I'm going to make matzah in a place where it's not tameh. So in order for Bnei Israel to show their kavanah and to show their love for Hashem, they said we're going to start the matzah here in a land of Tumah where it makes sense to make the matzah. Potentially, it could become chametz, and we turn it into matzah. That makes more sense. Now we could say uklapei zeh to this effect. We can say vayofu tabatzek asher otziu miYisrael ugot matzot. If you look in Parakut Bet. Right, exactly. Parakut Bet, pasuk lamed tet. It says, "Klomar shlofisha otziyam miYisrael lachen hayu got matzot kitukunam ki lo chametz." They couldn't become chametz. Ki shamrum karaui v'lo nichum lachmitz. I mean, they made these small dough, like patties, basically, but they didn't. They made it's like small dumplings, like small balls of dough. But they kept on. It couldn't become chametz. They didn't let it. They didn't let it become chametz. They just kept on watching it. They kept on doing something, so it never had the potential to rise. Right? That's why it says here.
How is it possible?
It's very possible that they
eating it.
Actually. Yeah. They would not become because they were driven out of. So he says.
They could literally to my mouth.
Right. The pasuk does not mean that the dough could not become chametz. I'm sorry, because they were driven out of before it could rise. The pasuk means that they baked it as matzot because they did not want it to become chametz. That's what he's saying. Okay, so let me read that again so we understand. So he says, "Vayofu tabatzek asher otziu miMitzrayim ugot matzot." They baked the dough that they took out of Mitzrayim into these things called matzah cakes. Okay? Klomar, lefisho tziyam Mitzrayim, since they took the dough out of Mitzrayim as ready-made dough and protected it from becoming chametz before they're leaving Mitzrayim. Lachein hayu ugot matzot kitikunam, because they were matzah, they were therefore ideal. Ki lo chametz, they could not become chametz. Ki shmarum karu'u v'lo nichum lachmitz.
There's a problem here, Mordecai.
What's that?
First of all, it's an interesting distinction between the fact that how did they eat Korban Pesach al matzot.
Right.
And that's one type of matzah.
Uh-huh.
And then there's the story of like, they were hastened out.
You missed the part that he says. That was two kinds of matzah.
Right. But
Matzah 1 is the shiubud, and matzah 2 is the geula. Right. But they couldn't eat the geula matzah yet, because the geula is only complete after Kriyat Yamsuf.
so the interesting thing, I guess I'm not sure if it's a question or not.
Yeah.
But the first one, the one of Galut, they ate at matzot, and there was no reason of saying that they were in a rush. Because they were sitting leisurely eating korban.
You missed that part, the right before he asked the question, if you know you're coming out, you know you're going out of Mitzrayim, right, it's coming in a minute, right? And I know I'm going to be prepared, so then why do I have to wait for the last possible minute to make my sandwich, right? Like, if I'm going to make a sandwich, I'll have my bag ready to go with the sandwich. I don't going to make the dough beforehand.
But here, in the matzah case,
Okay, yeah.
the Pshat says, "V'lo yachlu litma'ameh."
Right.
And here, it's like giving you like a reason that says, oh, there they were eating it because it was part of
The
korban.
korban.
And here, the second one was like, well,
Right, so they didn't. He says, right, they were never intended to let it rise and become chametz. So he says here,
which is not what the Pshat is.
right, exactly. That's exactly what he's saying. The pshat is not what he says when the pasuk says that they baked these dough cakes, these matzah cakes, whatever they call them, because they did not, for they could not become chametz because they were driven out of Mitzrayim and could not delay.
Right.
It doesn't mean that the dough could not become chametz because before they were driven out. Before it could rise, the pasuk means that they baked it as matzot because they did not want it to become chametz. That's what he said. That's how he understands.
Not the Pshat.
Not the pshat, for sure. Not the pshat.
Maybe they wanted to wait till the last minute to make it.
Right, to make it matzah. Right, in other to make it right.
So
Maybe
they held off on making it until the last minute, and then
right.
behechach.
Right. Now, but yeah, a little bit. That would be good. Yeah, thank you. So he says, "Aval adayin kasher, lama lo afu sham b'toch Mitzrayim." Like, there's your question. He says, still have a question. Why didn't they just make the dough while they were still in Mitzrayim? They already needed the dough. They made the dough in Mitzrayim. So if you're already starting the process, finish it off, and you have nice, hot matzah when you go out. The teretz and the rest of the pasuk makes sense now. Ki gorshu, they took the dough out as unbaked because they were driven out. Klomar, that focuses on the transition from chametz to matzah. The pasuk means shehem hayu svurim shel kitata nitzotzot aberim mitzrayim yeh b'choach hachanatam hatova u'maseim hatovim. So he says, Bnei Israel had this in mind that they thought that they had to the collecting of these sparks. Someone's barbecuing right there. Like it?
No, well, it's not good out there, but it's getting intense again.
Yeah, open the window or something. Anyway, so he says
more of the smoke.
right. So he says their eagerness to together with their kiyum the mitzvah would take out the tzotzot of kedusha from Mitzrayim, enabling them to finally leave. V'imkein achelo gamru ma'aseh mitzvah lo tavo shem geula. The completion of the complete geula will not come until they've finished the mitzvah. So what Bnei Israel were really assuming is that they wouldn't leave until they finished baking the matzah, turning the dough into matzah. So they began making the dough while in Mitzrayim, thinking that they would complete it there. Aval lo yaken adavar. Sha'adar abaklipa paltam me'atzma b'chol chayyon kol ma shabala min hakdusha. Actually, what happened is the opposite. They thought they had to wait for all the nitzotzot to be collected, and then they could leave. And so they waited to. Hashem didn't wait for them to complete their mitzvah. Rather, the opposite. Before they could even finish making their matzah, the klipa, that is Hashem's heavenly forces, expelled all the kedusha that it had swallowed, driving them out of Egypt. Hashem wanted them to complete the baking of their matzah in the domain of kedusha, so that he had to drive. So Hashem said, I see what you're doing. You want to get all the nitzotzot in before you want to leave. Hashem's like, no, we don't have time for that. I'm just gonna force you out. Whatever's happening, I'm taking you out now. Then the question is, when the next part of the pasuk reads, "V'lo yachlu litma'ameh," right? So he says, right? Had the pasuk been explaining why they did not let it rise, we could have read it did not have time to become chametz because they were being driven out. However, now that the pasuk is only saying that they did not have a chance to make it because they were driven out before they could do it, then the words "and they could not delay" seem extra. So he says, "V'lo dai ki gorshu mitzrayim," and the pasuk says not only because they were being driven out of Mitzrayim, "Dahainu sham mitzrim atzmam gershumu shlachum," ela v'lo yachlu litmameh sha'aya sham chipazon de shechina. It says the shechina was in a rush. Shelo hayta rotzah shitakvu sham klal be'otam tuma. Hashem said they didn't want to. Hashem didn't want them to stay in tuma anymore. Right? That's kind of follows in line with the 49 levels of tuma. They had to go right away, kind of thing. Although although Bnei Israel wanted to make their matzot and complete the whole matzah and complete the whole element of making all the nitzotzot out before they can leave, Hashem said, "No, we don't have time to wait. I got to get you out of here." Right? So Hashem said, "Do not want them to stay in Tumah Mitzrayim anymore." Now we have the last part of the pasuk. Right, and he's going to get to that right now. So he says, according to the Pshat of the pasuk, they had planned to prepare chametz they wanted to make sandwiches for the way. Right? According to the Pshat of the pasuk, they wanted to make sandwiches, right? But they were rushed out and before they had a chance to finish making the food. Right? So the end of the verse, did they have time to make tzeidah, right? Gam tzeidah, they didn't have time to make food, right? But according to the above approach, they would have had these matzahs even if they had not been rushed out, right?
Right.
Okay, so and even if they had prepared their food beforehand, they were careful not to eat chametz. What happens? Then the end of the pasuk mean when they said they didn't have time to make these tzeidah l'derech. So he says, "V'gam tzeidah lo asu lahem, shelo lakchu miMitzrayim ha'ma'achal hatzarich lahem." They did not take any food other than the basic provisions to take. They didn't want to take anything. Anything that they take out besides the basic, bread, flour, and water would have carried with it tumah. Right? Only those matzah cakes that they brought out of Mitzrayim as dough. That food was free of the tumah of Mitzrayim. He spikul on the derech nes ad chetzi iyar till the half of iyar. What happens in the half of iyar? Because now they have to start eating. Now they have a problem. Now they run out of food. They've run out of provisions. Right? If I only take flour and water out of Mitzrayim, at some point that's going to run out. So now they're derech nes. So he says, "V'tamu bahem." So he says, what do we know? What happens when we in the Parshat Tamid it says, so it's a bread from Hashem. It's not lechem min haaretz, lechem min hashamayim. So he says that the man, that these ugot matzot had the tam of man. It's a special, unique flavor. Anyway, so what he's saying here is that the Bnei Israel didn't want to take more than they needed to take out of Mitzrayim. They took out their flour, they took out some water, that's it. They didn't want to take any food that would carry with it, because that flour and water that they were making, these ugot matzot, were already, that had completed the kedusha already. Right? It was not any more tumah.
I would have taken a leftover from the korban.
Yeah, exactly. Leftover meat. Now he says, back to our original question. The original question is, why does the Baal Haggadah say, V'lo yachlu litma'ameh? That's not true.
It's the Torah says v'lo.
But the Torah says they couldn't eat it. But the korban, the mitzvah of eating matzah comes well before the mitzvah of eating matzah on Pesach.
They ate it with the Pesach.
Right. So right.
Oh, so you're saying why is
I have a question. I have the original. Why does the Baal Haggadah say? Why do we eat matzah? We eat matzah because we didn't have time to let the dough rise. That's not true. We have a mitzvah with the korban. So say that. That's fine. That's okay. That's a good reason. But don't say don't tell me when I'm growing up in kindergarten. We were all in kindergarten. We all say we didn't have time.
He's ruined it for me.
Right. Exactly. Spoiler. Right. Lachen amar Tana. Matzah zu shanochlim al shuma. Why do we eat this matzah? As we said, halo adayin anu bagalut v'chutz laaretz. We are still in it. Right. He says we have to eat. The Baal Haggadah says we have to eat matzah. Why? Because we ran out of time. That's the classic answer, right? But it seems out of place that we should be eating matzah at all. Why? What we said before that matzah represents
lechem oni.
Lechem oni. and lechem of shiabud, right? And then he says, but we are still in the land of galut. We're really not under the ideal scenario of living on Tachat HaKadosh Baruch Hu.
It's suitable that you're eating lechem.
Right? Dahainu ba'aretz, in his land. We're not in his land yet. Right? So he says, Bishlam avotenu necha shenitzavu lechal matzah ho'il v'shit tchila lahem hagula mi ba'erev k'mo shekatuv le'el b'samuch al pasuk ashir yalachem. Right? Aval anu she'oshvim begalut ve'en anu shum siman lekaruv hagula b'amotei rabim lama banu lanu tzivu lechal matzah. He says, we can understand why Bnei Israel had the mitzvah to do it, because they could taste the gula. The gula was there. They got it. But for us, we're still stuck in Galus land. Even us who live in Eretz Yisrael, and we have the zchut to live in Eretz Yisrael, we're still under Galut, no question asked, right? Okay, we don't have the Beit HaMikdash, we don't have the ideal scenario of living under Hashem's Shechina in the ideal scenario. He says, we shouldn't be eating it. Lama ba'lanu hatzivui lechol matzah. Why do we have a commandment to eat matzah at all?
But the tzivui was for when we were here with.
So he's getting right. So he says with Teretz, the Balak.
Assuming that right now we're in Galut, but it's like saying tzivui korbanot, right? Like.
Right. So he says, right. The Haggadah is questioning why that mitzvah applies to us while we're still in Galut. That's what he's asking.
Oh.
Matzah seems like, according to what we've just explained, matzah seems to be reserved for this, the reshut of Hashem. We're not under the reshut of Hashem yet. So if matzah is like this ideal food that we're supposed to eat when we're atachat kanfei Shechina, the real ideal scenario, if we're not in that situation, why do I have to eat, pardon me, cardboard on matzah on Pesach if I'm still in galut, right? I should be eating. Right? So he says, very good answer, I like it a lot. He says, L'zecher kavanah tova shekivnu Yisrael b'Mitzrayim. He says, why do we eat matzah? It's not because of the galut. It's not only, yes, the ideal scenario would be to be living under Hashem's Shechina, in the ideal scenario with the Beit HaMikdash and everything. He says, but rather our matzah is to remind us the kavanah tova of Bnei Israel at the time of Mitzrayim. Even though they were still in Mitzrayim, Shaloi speak, and their dough did not have time to become chametz because it would have become chametz had there been more time, but they didn't have enough time, right? So, and remember what we said, they made the matzahs dafka in chametz land, and because their kavanah was we're so eager to become part of under Hashem's Shechina and under Hashem's domain that we want to do it, and since we are so eager to do it. So Hashem says that kavanah, we want to remind us with that kavanah. And therefore we too eat matzot while we're still in galut. We're mekabel ol malchut shamayim on this day before we even reach being under Hashem's Shechina yet. In other words, we're saying just like Bnei Israel did, they did it even before they were actually out of Mitzrayim. They accepted Hashem's Ol Malchut Shamayim before. So to us who are still in Galut, we're accepting Hashem's Matzah ideal scenario. Even so, and he says, in fact, the opposite. He said the very zchut of eating this matzah and accepting Hashem's Ol Malchut Shamayim while we're still in Galut, we're asking Hashem make the gula come faster. Because we want Hashem. Right? Right? By us saying we want to do something early below, we're saying Hashem, we're going to wake something up early. We're testing it. So that's the first part of this Drush. We're going to take a 2-minute break. Sorry, I just want to drink something. Yeah. I want to. Is the camera on? Is on.
I can turn it off.
Okay, so it's still on. How you doing, Reuven?
Let's go. Good night.
Okay.
Zera Shimshon.
Okay, we're going to do the second part of Torah Aleph. Torah Aleph is still. We're going to continue with Torah Aleph. Torah Aleph is quite long. We're going to try to get to the second piece. We'll get through the second piece, and then, even though it's a long piece, we'll try to get through it.
Wait, you did one already? The first piece you did?
First piece. That's the end of the first piece.
Is that what we just did now?
That's the first piece. Now we're continuing. He's continuing with the idea of that we have to eat matzah, right? We know that the pasuk in Dvarim says that they didn't have time. We know that in the Vidui Masrot, right, that we say during Pesach, during the Haggadah, we say we didn't have time to eat matzah. We didn't have time to Right. And then it says then it says in pasuk Perek Tet Vav pasuk Gimel it says Tet Vav Tet Vav or Tet Zayin Perek Tet Zayin Tet Zayin.
Wait, what are we calling now? Which Parsha?
Dvarim Perek Tet Zayin pasuk Gimel.
Right.
Okay, so it says there that they didn't. Right, chipazon. They were out of haste. Okay, so, and Rashi says that they were leaving Mitzrayim they were rushed before the time the dough had a chance to rise. So they're saying that they.
Which correlates to Yochlu Litvamer.
Right, exactly. Hold on, he's going to get to that too, right? So he says.
I'm not giving him an easy time here.
Good, that's good. By the way, I just want to let you know that the other day I was learning with a friend of mine, Drush Chet on Haggadah. And we came to a conclusion, and I wrote to Rav Zilberberg, who's the head, and I said, can we make this conclusion? And he's like, oh, I've never thought about that. I'm going to have to think about it. Because we came up with a chiddush, because I was like, I'm pushing. This other guy came and he's like, I don't understand. Because what Perek Chet, the Drush Chet, quickly, it says, why does the Baal Haggadah the Baal Haggadah, again, he says, like, why do we need to bring Sefer Dvarim and from Shemot? Like, why do we bring proof when we talk about Aramiyah V'David? The whole thing comes through, and then we bring psukim from Shemot to support what is said in Sefer Dvarim. That doesn't make sense, right? It's pretty straightforward what's going on there, and a whole thing there. But there's like a part of it is that we scream to Avotenu, and so most of us say we scream to our forefathers, but that doesn't make sense according to the Zera Shimshon. And then I said that maybe there's a combination between two things. Anyway, in the first part of the drush that we just said, he said that the fact that their dough was baked as matzah had no connection to their speed or leaving early, right? So they had to bake matzah in any case due to the Isur Chametz. And so he said that the pasuk that was brought by the Haggadah does not explain why they eat matzah. Was not offering a reason why they have to eat matzah, to have a mitzvah to eat matzah. The Haggadah was explaining only that why the mitzvah to eat matzah is appropriate even while they were in Galut. In the second part, that's Chilek Bet of Drush Aleph, if you will, right? Zera Shimshon is going to explain how our matzah recalls the Yetziah Mitzrayim and how to understand another difficulty. So he says, what does it mean to have to be b'chipazon? Haste. Right now we have with the above approach, what we just said before, which is that it was nothing to do with the fact that regarding the pasuk that says they were driven out of Mitzrayim and they could not delay. According to the Pshat pasuk, it says that the pasuk says that they were driven out. The fact that it says that they were driven out explains why they couldn't bake the matzah, meaning they had to make matzah because they didn't have time for the dough to rise, right? Which was why the matzah that we eat today is basically saying that it seems like it was almost like an accident, right? In other words, why did we eat matzah? We ate matzah because we didn't have time. Right, they weren't prepared, so therefore we're eating matzah because they made a mistake, right? That's what it sounds like. Again, of course, sounds very simple about it, but okay. He says, how could it be that because of their, I don't want to call it mistake, but their rush, we have to suffer for a whole week eating matzah? Like, that doesn't make sense.
Now listen, I don't have it in front of me.
But
the clue to me is that when they're eating the korban, how do they eat it? Meaning it was imminent.
Right.
They were about to leave.
Right.
Meaning it's not like they made a mistake. It was like
they were just waiting for the second to go, and they had to right.
Right.
So that's I think he gets to that here or the next one part of it. Anyway, so he says. How could we even? He says even more so. Mela we eat the matzah, but now we have an isur. We have a isur of karet. It's not only like that. Now I can understand that I'm eating matzah to remember the mitzvah. Okay, I got it. But now I'm saying is not only do I have to remember the mitzvah, if I eat chametz, I have an isur karet. That's a big deal.
And the whole thing of that isur karet is because they didn't have enough time.
Right. It sounds weak. Right. So that's what he's saying. So he says, according to many of the way we are, according to our interpretation on the pasuk, the first part of the drush, we are not saying that they were right. We are not saying that they were made mistake. They made the matzah by mistake when they were leaving. Rather, the reason why we eat matzah is, as the mefarshim say, al kipi chipazon yatzat me'eretz Mitzrayim. You left Mitzrayim with haste. They explained that if Hashem would not have left them right away at that moment, what would happen? Now we know that they would have already sunk to the 49th level of Tumah. Had they left and gotten to right, excuse me. Right, this is why we are commanded to eat matzah and destroy the chametz from our midst. To allude to this fact that there was that moment, like you said. There was not enough time to wait until they completed their efforts to defeat the klipot. Because had they left 1 second later, they would have been stuck. There was nothing. We would have no chance. Right, so he says, they didn't have. In the meantime, they would not have reached. They would have reached the 50th level of Tumah, right? And then they wouldn't have been able to save themselves. As the Gemara in Brachot says in Daf Hey of Brachot, a prisoner cannot free himself out of prison, right? That is, even if someone has the ability to save others from prison, right? If he is placed in prison, he will be unable to save himself, right? So he's saying is, with their own efforts, Bnei Israel would not have been able to take themselves out of the lowest level of Tumah, right? To commemorate the fact that they couldn't get themselves out of that last level of Tumah, Hashem had to take us out out of that, between that 49 and 50, that split second, Hashem take us out, and therefore we're eating matzah to commemorate the fact. It wasn't like a rush, right? Like you said, it was that moment. We were ready, but we just didn't know when, so we just had to just get up and go.
Right.
Now he says, he says, now he moves away from the matzah for a second, and he says, I have a question, right? It focuses on the whole idea of chipazon, what is the whole point of the chipazon? That Hashem took us out of Mitzrayim, chipazon, and we're on page 627, and we're in the middle of the page there. So he says, why we have a question, what Hashem did. Lama hibtin legalinu ad zibula batra. Why did Hashem wait till that last possible moment to take us out? Like he says, I don't understand this whole thing of chipazon, right? Hashem knew what was going to happen,
but it was a timed chipazon.
Right, exactly. So he says, if it was time chipazon, the opposite. If it's time chipazon, what shall you do? Give me 5 extra minutes. I don't need it to be. I don't need to be rush. Right? That doesn't make sense. If I knew already that we're going to leave, bring everything back, push everything back up a little bit, 5 minutes by each makkah, and then let them walk out panacha. Why do I have to do this chipazon thing?
Meaning the kushya that we have, at least for me, is that there's 2 scenarios.
Right.
One is them eating korban Pesach.
Right.
And they're sitting,
relaxing and enjoying.
Relaxing with their families.
Right.
But they're like chayalim.
Right.
With their konenut. Right.
Right. They're konenut. Right.
On them.
Right.
Their stick, and they're ready to go, but they're sitting.
Right. That is matzah. That's when they can eat the shawarma. Right. That's when they eat the shawarma. The dough. It's nice. They can eat it. Possible. Good. Second, stage 2 is now they're like, wait a minute. What are we going to take with us? So there we're taking matzah balls. Not the matzah balls that we know, but the matzah dough.
They put on that in their shoulders.
They put it on their They put it on their sack, and they're like, we're waiting for that moment, and that's why we're making the dough here, but we're not cooking it because we want to save it for there. Okay, yeah, go ahead. That's scenario number 1. Scenario 2.
Right, but your question about 5 more minutes is basically that the rush was self-imposed.
I see what you're saying. Meaning that they're like, we don't want to wait for the call. We're just going to go out and do it. Like
meaning. You're done with your. I'm saying if I had to paint a picture.
Right, like you're saying.
I'm saying like they had their shawarma. It's night, right?
Right.
No one's stopping you from
leaving,
preparing.
Right.
Preparing, even if you don't know when it is.
That's exactly right. That's what they did. They prepared everything, but they didn't know when, so they kept on working the dough and saying, we're going to make the dough now, so that when we do get into Tachat Kenfei HaShechina, we can make the matzah. We can make matzah, because matzah is the ideal
because if not for that explanation, there's no reason why they couldn't have left with matzot.
Right. Now, so he says, he still has a question. Why couldn't we just be... He said, it sounds like Hashem was kind of forcing us to leave b'chipazon.
Right.
That doesn't make sense. He says that according to in Baba Kama Daf Kaf Zayin, it says avid inish dina danafshe olo. A person may not enforce himself, whether a person may enforce the law for himself. Let's say a person sees a robber carrying one of his belongings, meaning Reuven lost something, a robber stole something from Reuven, and he sees that the Shimon, the robber, or Joe, the robber, has his thing.
He has to call the police. He can't.
Right. Well, the question is whether he can enforce the law on himself. Meaning, can I be the cop and say, dude, you just stole something from me? Or do I have to call the cop and say, wait for the cop to come?
Depending
right?
on which country you're in.
All agree that if there would be a loss, if he does not take any action, a person may enforce the law for himself.
Right.
Okay, now you have to define what is a loss. Okay, whatever. Anyway, so he says, right? He said, if they do not free them, right, they would have been stuck in the right. Right? He says, had the Bnei Israel waited, the loss would have been that all of Bnei Israel would have been wiped out basically off the earth. So that's the end of that's the V'oil shadin hu, right? D'miyakom psida avid inish l'dina nafshe afilu b'haka'ah, right? Kanirem sham yashas midivya rosh vayin sham mishum hachi lo atzar kadosh baruch hu la'amid hadavar b'din. Right? He didn't want to choose to bring the matter to court. Hashem could have taken the Bnei Israel out earlier, but he would have to do so legally. I mean, he would have to give like the whole, Shakla Vitaria with all his court. Justified, right? Addressing all the against them. Elohim I mean, he said, if I do it at that moment of 49 to 50, then I'm basically forcing the hand. Right? What was he doing? He's saying is otherwise I have to start dealing with the other side. Right, the side
Could
of
you have done anything else besides that?
Right, or why do they deserve to leave at all? Right, they did all these other things. Right, so he says, I don't want to do that. So Hashem was forcing their hand and saying, if I get them to that last possible second, right? We all know, right? We always have these Yeshuot, right? You're stuck at something. I can tell you this week. I had this crazy story of Yeshua, right? We had a court date for something. We were suing an airline. And I really didn't want to go. I really didn't want to go. There was nothing on the top of 10 things of me not doing. That was number one, and maybe even higher than that. And I was like, I just don't want to go. And I was just like, I don't know how we're going to get out of this. I told my wife, I just don't want to go. I dive in. I said everything. I said, I just don't want to go. And I was just like, we're going to have to get. But there was no way to get around it. And then finally, the day comes, and they're like, okay, you have to be there at whatever time. And I was like, listen, I have a really important meeting. If I'm late, I'm running the meeting. It's not even like I can pass it on the meeting.
Is that true?
Yeah, it happened this week, Sunday. So I had a meeting, and I said, I can't miss it. And the meeting was originally going to be the last week, but it got pushed off to this week. So I was like, I have this meeting. I can't not be there. So I'm like, listen, I'm taking my computer. If we get late, I'm just going to jump out. I don't care, court, no court, whatever. As we're about to get to the tunnel. And they get a call saying, it's been delayed. We tried everything. Like we were doing. The court called us and said we're being delayed. So I was like, all right, it seems like that moment, you're just like, you're waiting for that moment to happen. Everyone's had those stories. We're waiting for that moment. All right, so we're going to have to stop in a second. Anyways, it does say, what's the reason? We'll skip it. But anyway, the idea, what he brings in this drush is that Hashem he purposely waited for that last possible moment, the chipazon moment, in order so that we wouldn't have to start dealing with the legal issue of do they deserve to leave, do they not deserve to leave, what about this chait that they did here, what about this chait that they did here, and he brings other proofs. He brings other situations where this moment of Yeshua happens throughout the Tanakh and other stories.
Politically, all these discussions